Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Katie and I thoroughly enjoyed being able to talk with Professor Nancy Pearcey, who is the author of two books that we've really enjoyed, and we've actually mentioned both of them on this podcast. One is The Toxic War on Masculinity, which is the book that we speak the most about today, but then also the book Love Thy Body, and that's one that we've mentioned a handful of times. She has written a variety of books, and we encourage you to get and read all of them because she has so much insight into just into different social studies and culture in general, and she speaks about it from a Christian perspective and in a way that's very, I guess, graspable. A lot of social science books seem very academic and just like hard to read, like not fun, but hers are very enjoyable to read and very graspable. I'm going to read her bio really quick and then we'll get into the interview. Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science Saving... Okay, I'm going to start again, you guys. Bear with me. Do you have time, Katie?
I'm here all day.
Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in the Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. What a cool thing to be called.
I would also say that totally makes sense.
Yes.
She's brilliant.
Yes.
And I do like, you mentioned that studies in sociology, is that what you said, are sometimes hard to read. But then on the flip side, a lot of books that deal with topics like masculinity, femininity, transgenderism, like confusion of the sexes and stuff like that, are also written kind of from this emotional worldview.
Yes.
And she doesn't do that. You
Right.
can tell the research is there.
Yes.
And she's coming at it from this angle. I mean, she's a professor. It's not just like an emotional right.
Yeah, she's leading with the facts.
Yeah. So I really, really respect that and appreciate it.
Me too. Well, folks, enjoy the episode. If you do enjoy it, please take time to leave a rating or a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen. If you watch this on YouTube, maybe hit the subscribe button or hit the like button. Leave a comment if you enjoy it. Really, any of those things we would really appreciate. Let's get this going.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
All right. Well, Professor Pearcey, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We have mentioned your work for quite a while now on the podcast. We've mentioned it a handful of times. And so it's really fun for us to have you, the actual author of so many great books, on our podcast. And, speaking of your books, I'm curious, this most recent book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, from the get-go, when I started reading this, it was really encouraging to me because I grew up in a conservative Christian family. I consider myself a conservative Christian man, and yet I felt like I have been fighting this cultural stigma that conservative Christian men are the worst husbands in the world. And early on in this book, you tell us that that's actually not true at all. Can you expound upon that?
Yes, I love starting with the good news. and that was really good news. I certainly didn't expect it because, like everyone else, I've heard all the media stereotypes saying that evangelical Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity. Well, let me just give you one example. It was easy to find them. But the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement, said the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so what happened is the social scientists were listening to these charges and saying, but where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And I do quote about a dozen studies in the book that all find that, in fact, Christian men test out as the most loving husbands and fathers of any group in America. They do interview the wives separately, which is important. And their wives report the highest level of happiness with the way their husbands treat them. Evangelical fathers spend more time with their kids than any other group, 3.5 hours more per week than secular men. Christian couples divorce at a lower rate than the rest of the culture, 35% lower than secular couples. And they have actually the lowest rate of domestic violence and abuse of any group in America. So sometimes they can drive it home with a quote. So let me give you a quote. The sociologist who has done the most work on this subject, the biggest study, is at the University of Virginia, Brad Wilcox. And to give you a sense of his stature, he gets invited to publish in places like the New York Times. So this was a New York Times article where he said, and this is a direct quote, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages." And then he turns to his secular colleagues. I don't know if you know, sociology tends to be very secular and as a discipline. And he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. They are consistently the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. So this is astonishing information. I mean, it's not out there in the public yet. It's not even out there in the church yet. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find these studies. And I say we need to bring this into the churches for starters. Like you said, Christian men feel beaten down by the anti-masculine kind of messages we get. When I told my class that I was doing writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Whoa, even young Christian men are feeling this. And this is not, just a pep talk from some religious leader. This is solid empirical research. This is evidence-based findings. So we should be very confident about bringing it both into the church and into the public arena as well.
Well, I have no doubt of those facts, and I'm very encouraged by them because that's what I have lived. Like, that's what I've seen to be true. But I have experienced, my dad being called these horrible things, or people reading into him being an abusive or overlording father. And then, I love my marriage and have seen Elisha have these assumptions made about him. And I think that even the church is so quick to read into the narrative of, well, this masculinity must be toxic. And we know that God's ways are the best ways if we believe scripture. And so it makes sense that those who are doing their best to live out his, rule book would be having higher levels of success and happiness. But something that really shocked me was that divorce statistic. So why do we hear everywhere we go, Google or all these different things, that we're divorcing at the same rate in the church as the secular culture? Like, I've never heard that there's, a lower divorce rate within the church.
That's right. And that's the first pushback I always get too, by the way, is, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate? And in fact, in my research, I found that it is one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. So, we've been really using it to try to motivate people, apparently. But so what the researchers did is they went back to the data and they made this really crucial separation between the men who are actually church-going, committed, authentic Christians, and men who do not attend church, who might check the Baptist box, for example, on a survey like this, but who attend church rarely, if at all. And these men test out dramatically different. So these would be what we call nominal Christians. My students don't know what the word nominal means, so I tell them NOM is Latin for name, and it means in name only. And they test out with all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness of any group. They spend less time with their children. They have a higher rate of divorce, even higher than secular couples, 20% higher. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So this is the real shocker. And I'll quote Brad Wilcox again, the same sociologist. He wrote an article for Christianity Today. And he has one line out of there that I took. He said, the most violent husbands in America are evangelical men who attend church rarely, if at all. So this is what we're up against in the church, that on the one hand, we have the best men, the ones who are really committed and, like you said, trying to live out Jesus' way, because obviously whatever God tells us is going to be best. And we need to be encouraging those men more, I think. I have a graduate student who's the head of the women's ministry at a very large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And I thought, okay, no more of that, no more scolding. We need to bring this data into the church to really encourage men who are doing a good job. And then we need to really think through a more effective discipleship program for these men who are nominal, who are using words like headship and submission, but infusing them with secular meanings, right, of entitlement, dominance, control, and so on. And by the way, sometimes people ask me, well, why do they test out as actually worse than secular men? And apparently, the researchers have figured out that, well, a secular guy who may be hitting his wife and kids does not feel any religious justification for what he's doing. But the nominal Christian man says, well, I'm supposed to be the head of the home, so it's okay for me to do what I want with my kids, or she wouldn't submit, so I had to put her in her place. And so the nominal Christian man actually ends up with the worst of both worlds because he feels religious justification for his abuse. So this is what we're up against in the church. How do we disciple these men and help them to develop a more biblical understanding of what the Bible really teaches about marriage and masculinity?
So we have to interrupt this episode that is incredible to let you know about Good Ranchers. They are our sponsor for this episode, as per usual. And I have to say, Good Ranchers is getting some serious buzz around our local community. We were talking about it at our home group a couple weeks ago. I was talking about it with a friend at co-op the other day. Went over to someone's house. They were talking about it. And guess what? They've all used our code, VOTEBERG, to get the Good Ranchers offer of the month. If you already ordered in March, then you got their 10-pound ham, $119 heritage ham, for free. And if you are listening to this after that deal has passed up, don't worry, because they have another offer running right now. Well, I can't speak to exactly what that is. Check down in the description box and use our code VOTEBERG at goodranchers.com to be able to get a discount on your meat. And if you've never heard of Good Ranchers before, it's American meat delivered. It shows up directly on your doorstep. It is packaged and prepared so that there is no ick. When you're dealing with the meat, it's all individually wrapped and sealed. It's so nice to handle. You can get meat that has been pre-sliced, pre-seasoned. It makes meal prepping a breeze. And there are two things we primarily love about it. One, it goes beyond all the organic standards in the United States. Two, it is a Christian company. Three, I'm going to keep going. Their chicken is pasture raised, so it's not just organic, it's also pastured. And their beef is grass fed. And also, I was going to say one more thing about it, but I feel like that's pretty good.
Yeah, you got to 4 things. That was good.
Yeah, there's a lot. Oh, yeah, anyways. But yeah, I'm not going to keep going.
You're not going to go to the 5th?
No, I'm not going to keep going to the 5th. But use our code, VOTEBERG. It is down in the description box below. And then you guys can be talking in your community at your home groups about Good Ranchers, their quality that we totally stand behind. That makes a lot of sense because we've talked about this for a long time. It's like it's essentially those men who know a Bible verse, take it out of context, and then abuse it. Yeah. And they have no relationship with their creator, but instead are just like, oh, I can use this as a manipulation tactic. And then it gets pinned on Christianity, which was not, the intent of the user.
Yeah. Yeah. To that point, we want men in the church. We want men to be vibrant, members and leaders within the church. And our current day and age, you talk about in your book, this isn't the first time that, the church has been predominantly female. You actually point back to the early church where you're thinking, no, there is a reason that women have been very attracted to Christianity because it speaks so highly of women. It elevates women, and it has obviously since the beginning, since Christ has came and he preached the gospel message. So with that, and then you bring it to our common day. You even talk about examples where churches do like MMA nights, or that they do like hunting giveaways. They're like, we've got to get men into the services. But could you particularly speak to kind of that pre-industrial revolutionary period that you speak to in your book, where it was very common for men not only to be involved in the church, but the home? They were an everyday part of the home. And then what kind of led to them not being involved on a regular basis?
Yeah, in my book, I really wanted to understand how I'm an apologist at heart, right? I like to show where the secular world gets things wrong. And I wanted to understand why the secular world gets masculinity so wrong. And many people think, well, the negative views of masculinity started in the 60s, maybe with second wave feminism. No, it's much further back. As you point out, you have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, because before that, men worked side by side with their family all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And in fact, a surprising historical fact is that most books and articles on parenting and childrearing were addressed to men, to fathers. Whereas today, if you go into a bookstore, most are addressed to women. Because fathers were considered the primary parent, and especially their sons, of course. The sons were virtually apprentices with them in their craft or trade. And even secular historians will acknowledge this. I love this. One of the historians said, the definition of masculine virtue was duty to God and man. It was very much duty and service oriented. And so the question is, where did we lose that? And it started with the Industrial Revolution, because that took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, American men were not working with their family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And you can imagine that would change their mindset to some degree. And that's when we first began to see people protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos, that they were becoming self-centered, egocentric, greedy and acquisitive, to use some of the language of the day, and even turning their career into an idol. I was surprised at how many 19th century people complained that men were turning financial success into an idol. And by the way, this is also when America secularized. So they were, in fact, turning it into a substitute religion, because after the Industrial Revolution, there arose a sharp split between the private and public realm, between the home and these large public institutions like factories and businesses, financial institutions, universities, and the state. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should be run by what they called scientific principles. But what they really meant was value-free. Right? Don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. And since it was men who were, in fact, in that public realm and getting that secularized education, men became secular in their outlook before women did. And so that was part of what caused the tension between men and women as well, because for a long time then, in a sense, women became the conscience of men, as men's behavior deteriorated. Well, let me give you an example. Through the 19th century, there was a huge increase in drinking, gambling, fighting, prostitution. And well, there was a reason that there was a temperance movement. Sometimes a single fact can crystallize it. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So there was a huge problem with, these new cities where especially younger men were coming in. They were no longer connected to the sort of accountability structures like their family and their village and their church. And so, in fact, a lot of what we now call toxic behavior in men did start in the 19th century. And the language that was used to condemn them was also just about as harsh as what we hear today.
Wow. Well, that's encouraging, I guess.
Yeah.
If you're considering where we're at today.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's just so interesting that they would use that term value free within these public institutions, because that, I don't even know if that's possible, to say, hey, of course, some standard is going to be infused within the education system, within the banking system, within the factories and the workplace. And so that was, to think that it could maintain, a lot of times people will think, oh, secularism is just kind of neutral. But you're like, well, no, We are religious beings, and some sort of ideology is going to be put in place of Christianity, and that's exactly what started to happen there.
Well, along with that, oh yeah, you go ahead.
Well, you're right. You're right. The term value free was really used to kick Christianity out of the public square, especially in science, in the universities, for example. Materialism, naturalism, empiricism, all of these secularisms were so-called neutral, and only Christianity was biased. So, I write about this actually more in my earlier book, Total Truth. I talk especially about how the universities were secularized, and that phrase "value free" was the most widely used to try to say, "Well, you Christians are biased, so you have no voice, in the academic realm or in the public realm." So I'm glad you jumped on that phrase, because that's exactly how it was used until very recently.
And along with that, in your book, you talk about how the Darwinian theory of evolution actually normalized a lot of the traits that we now are labeled, now considered toxic when it comes to masculinity. How did that impact men?
I'm glad you asked that, because in my book, I go through several stages of the secularization of the masculine script. And that one is surprising, just because most people think evolution is about science, and they don't realize that it actually had a huge impact on concepts of masculinity. Social Darwinists began to say that the men who won out in the struggle for survival would be ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and predatory. And instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, as Christians did, they began to urge men to live down to what they called the beast within, that was your true nature. And what's worse is that it didn't stop with the 19th century. Social Darwinism is still very impactful in our own day. It's got a new label. It's called evolutionary psychology. But let me give you some examples. There's a book called The Moral Animal, best-selling book. So it's had a lot of impact. And the author says the human male is an oppressive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving him a book on how to have a better marriage is like giving a Viking a book on how not to pillage. I thought, how do you get away with such a negative view? Wow. But apparently, he thinks this is saying men can be tough. Or another one that it was an older book that was just reissued called Men in Marriage. And he too says the human male is by nature irresponsible, violent, and sexually predatory. His deepest yearning is not for wife and family, but for the motorbike and the open road and the male group escape to a primal and predatory mode of immediate gratification. I think I've got all those words right. But I look at this and I say, this isn't how God created men. This is the script that informs the Andrew Tates of the world. If you want to know the intellectual roots for Andrew Tate and for the manosphere, this is where it's coming from. It's sexually predatory. By the way, there's a new one too, who's a new online influencer who's been heralded in the New York Post as the new Andrew Tate. His name is Myron Gaines, and his tagline is, "I help men transform from simps into pimps."
Wow.
So this is the secular script as it exists today. And I'll give you a footnote to that. The reason we need to care about it is because our young men need to have a critical grid in place or they will absorb it. I got an email from a former graduate student who now teaches high school. And she said, all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook. And I said, well, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school. And when I put this on Twitter, I heard from several teachers saying, yep, all the way down to 5th grade, 4th grade, the kids are talking about Andrew Tate. So that's why it's so important for us to know what the secular world teaches as well, so that we can help our young men have a critical grid.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say to that point, I think when I came to that section of your book and you started talking about Darwin's theory and how it's impacted masculinity, at first I was a little disappointed because you were talking about how, Teddy Roosevelt, this was kind of part of his rhetoric at times, not all the time. And then even, one of my favorites, Jack London, it's obviously the evolutionary pole is a big part of his writing, which you can see obviously when you're a Christian, you see that worldview. And I've heard you talk about how, so those are some examples maybe back there in that, I don't know, that would be the 1900, or I guess Jack London 1900s and Teddy Roosevelt 1900s. But then I guess when I was reading that, it made me worried because I think we're doing the same thing in a lot of ways in the modern day. Maybe it's not, Jack London and Teddy Roosevelt, but there are a lot of people would even label them conservative voices, but they're using a lot of this, what you would, I think, articulate as Darwinian theory to encourage masculinity versus what the Bible teaches and saying, no, don't go out into the wild and, chase wolves to find your inner self. Go to God's word, return home, take up the responsibility of being a husband and a father seriously. So could you speak to that as well?
Yeah. Glad you brought that up because a conservative woman on my Twitter feed just the other day said a man needs to be a gentleman and a barbarian. And when I hear barbarian, that's the term, one of the terms that the social Darwinists liked, that we're barbarians at heart. And so what I do in my book, many times I take people back to the cultural mandate. I don't think we've emphasized that enough. Because when we call a man to be a strong Christian, often they think in terms of go to church, pray and sing, and it seems rather narrow. We have kind of a sacred secular split where religion is kind of in the sacred realm where we talk about church and Bible study, but we don't always know how it applies to the rest of our life. So the cultural mandate, my students don't even know what that word means. So it goes back to Genesis. So it's pre-fall. It's the calling that God gave humans before the fall. He's created the universe, the plants and animals. He creates the first human couple. What is the first thing he says to them? He says, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And in the streamlined language of Genesis 1, we can really unpack that. There's several layers because anthropologists will tell us that all social institutions start with a family. So it doesn't just mean the nuclear family. It means the extended family, which turns into a clan, which turns into a tribe, which turns into a village, and finally a nation, right? And then there are social institutions for particular purposes, like the village needs some kind of a state, some kind of a church, a school, a marketplace. And so it calls men and women, but we're talking about men in particular, calls them to a very rich sense of, you are serving God, you're obeying the cultural mandate when you build up your culture. And then subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So that has to do with any form of work where we're dealing with, it starts with agriculture, then technology and mining and inventing computers and composing music. And one of my students once said, oh, come on, composing music. So I said, I play the violin. What's the violin made out of? Wood and the bow, horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty we associate with music starts with harnessing the forces of nature in the world that God created. And so I think if we can flesh out the cultural mandate, especially for men, because it gives them a sense that their calling before God is much richer than just, the narrow sacred realm, but includes the entire secular, quote unquote, realm as well. It gives them a scope for ambition and for accomplishment and for achievement and impact, which I think men in particular need. And so I think that will give men that really full orb sense of what it means to be a Christian. That like you were saying, you don't have to reach out to the manosphere and the red pillars. That's what I'm hearing that term a lot these days, Christians reaching out to the red pill types. You don't need to reach out to them. You need to recover a stronger sense of the cultural mandate, which, like you said, starts with the family, not escaping, not escaping off into the wild, Not that there's anything wrong with nature, but if it's an escape, there's something wrong with it. But rolling up your sleeves and really investing in the social world and in productive and creative work.
Yeah, and what I hear you saying is just all this masculine energy and aggression and all these like good traits that men have. It doesn't have to always be destructive, or you said, barbaric. This woman explained it as, in order to be masculine. You could use that same exact energy to not be predatory, but to be a protector. It requires the same energy to build into God's cultural mandate and to protect and to provide and to defend. And it requires all those same skill sets. So it doesn't need to be a destructive behavior in order to be masculine, or what we, consider manly, and not be this feminine, maybe just worship or something. Yeah.
In fact, one of my favorite studies, by the way, was done by a non-Christian, by an anthropologist. And he did the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And he found that despite the differences between cultures, they all share a common code for manhood, which is amazing. They all share, and he summarized it as the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. In other words, become a father, build into the next generation. And I thought this was fascinating because what it means is, to tie into what you just said, men do know that their unique masculine strengths are not given them to get whatever they want, to stomp on other people, but that they intrinsically know what it means to use their strengths to provide, protect, and raise a family. And these were not cultures with a Christian background. And so I thought that was amazing. What it means is men are made in God's image, right? And they have this inherent, innate, universal knowledge of what it means to be a good man and to use their strength, as you point out, for good and for building people up.
And I'm curious, because you mention in your book that, the best way that we could encourage young men coming up, that next generation, to not absorb these secular ideals when it comes to masculinity is from a father, walking with a father, apprenticing with a father. And yet we see in media, which you point out, fathers are buffoons and they're presented that way. Where did that stem from?
Yeah, we all know it, right? We all know the media mocks and ridicules fathers, but we don't know where it came from. Again, you have to go back to the Industrial Revolution, because when fathers were taken out of the home, for the first time, men were not the primary parent. They were not there all day. And already in the 19th century, you see people saying that fathers have become irrelevant, superfluous, and incompetent because they were no longer in touch with the family dynamics. And we're so used to it that we don't realize what a shock it was. It was a huge shock. You see all kinds of articles and books at the time lamenting the loss of the father. 1842, Parents Magazine said the greatest source of sorrow, that's how they put it, the greatest source of domestic sorrow today is that the father can hardly even live with his family anymore, right? Because he's out of the home all day. It said the father toils early and late and has no time to perform his duties to his children. And another book put it this way: God is the father, and yet the prototype of God is gone from the family from Sunday to Sunday. Remember, they didn't have Saturdays off yet. So they would say from Sunday to Sunday, the father is gone now. And the leading psychologist of the day said, never before has the American boy been so wild, because his father was not there to supervise him anymore. Never before has the American boy been so wild and so half orphaned. I love that phrase. The boy has been half orphaned because his father's not there anymore, and has been left to female guidance in home, school, and church. So I think it's really important that we look back and say, when the father was first removed from the home, it was considered traumatic, and we shouldn't be used to it. I think we should go back to seeing it as a problem that so many men do not have the opportunity to be as invested in their, especially their sons, because like you said, let me give you some of the studies. There was a study done on how effectively families pass on their religious convictions to their children. 35-year longitudinal study, won all kinds of awards. And they found two things that were most surprising. One is fathers matter more than mothers. And my female students say, well, that's not fair. And I say, well, that's a fact. Mothers have an impact too. But if the father is a committed Christian, he has a greater impact than the mother does. But number two, it depends on the quality of the relationship. If the father is a moral exemplar, pillar of the church, has perfect theology, but if he's perceived as cold, distant, and authoritarian, the kids won't follow him. They will not follow him in the faith. So it's the quality of the relationship. And this was underscored by another study. This was done by a secular person, and just on how to produce masculine sons. Because that's what we want to know, right? How do we produce sons who are masculine? And it was fascinating because he found the same thing. It's the quality of the relationship with the father. And he said, the researcher said, the father's own masculinity didn't matter. In other words, whether he's more macho, or more gentle, that didn't matter. What mattered is if he had a warm, close, loving relationship with his son, then his son would have a secure sense of masculinity. So whether you're getting it from the Christian side or the secular side, they're both coming up with the importance of the father for young boys growing up really secure in their sense of masculinity.
Wow.
And I'm curious from a research standpoint, have you seen things, when a father's going to disciple his children or invest in his sons and invest in his daughters in a practical way, have you seen some things to be more helpful than other things, or is it just the father being present and doing life with the family?
I'm really big on seeing if we can reproduce in some way the pre-industrial age. In other words, kind of reflects the workplace, because, quantity matters too. They say quantity time and quality time. You have to have a certain amount of quantity to get quality. And the pandemic was a game changer because a lot of fathers discovered they liked being with their kids. Harvard University, this is not in the book because it's just very recent. Harvard University did a study, and they said during the pandemic, 68% of fathers said they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. And I thought, and not only that, but it was reported in the New York Times, which I thought was pretty cool. And so I have a whole chapter in the book on ways in which we might be able to flex the workplace. And I'll give you just one anecdote, because stories can bring it to life. So this was one of my graduate students. She was married to an IT worker professional, and he came home during the pandemic. And because he was home, he was available to be more involved with the homeschooling. And he decided he would be the one to make lunch every day for the family. Because he was there, he was able to take his kids to soccer practice, choir practice. And so I interviewed him, and he said, our family is so much more balanced now. I am never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle. And then the final kicker was, he told me, during the time I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying with my wife every morning. So I thought, okay, stories like that can inspire us, to see if there's a way that we can, in fact, we're not totally stuck with the industrialized workplace. And millennials, by the way, are much more demanding. They're saying, no, I'm not going to live for my job. I want to be involved with my family, but it's going to take some time. Oh, the other side of it is, this is important too. We have to get the corporations on board, right? Because, just because fathers want more time doesn't mean the corporations are going to say yes. But that changed during the pandemic too. In my book, I quote several CEOs who say things like, well, here's a direct quote. We were always nervous about remote work, right? Because they thought people would slough off and not get their jobs done. But one CEO said, during the pandemic, our fears were totally exploded. We did not see any drop in productivity. And so the corporate world is starting to be more open too, to allowing parents. And I got quotes from CEOs who said things like, if you give fathers more time to be invested fathers, they actually make better workers. They're more motivated when they're on the job. They're more focused because they want to get back to their family. And so they actually make better workers. It's a win-win, for both sides.
Yeah, they're reminded of why they're providing in the first place, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think of that even, pre the tech boom, my dad and Katie's dad were extremely creative in finding ways to free up their time so they could spend more time with their families, and both that led to them being more entrepreneurial than maybe, the average person. But even now, you don't even have to be entrepreneurial now. You can work remotely. You can now talk to your boss and say, hey, I'll get the work done in 4 days instead of 5, and then I can have 3 days with my family. And I think that that's really encouraging, to fathers. I think that should be something that they pursue. Real quickly, if you could, because this is something that I was actually going to kind of poke fun at Katie. Are you ready for this? We might need a public repentance here, because you talk about the flappers, okay? And Katie and I actually, before we were married, went to a costume party, and you know what Katie dressed up as? She dressed up as a flapper. Can you explain to her why she needs to repent from that? No, I'm joking. But can you actually kind of share some of the history of the flappers and what that kind of came from?
Oh, yeah. So that's an interesting history. We do have some of a double standard, right? Where women are in some ways considered the ones who are supposed to hold the line. Say in a dating relationship, for example, it's kind of assumed, partly because of the secular script, that men are just more prone to sexual sin and pornography and vice, and that it's up to women, especially like in a dating relationship, for example, to hold the line on the physical relationship. So we have a bit of a double standard. Where did that come from? So in the 19th century, I love the way you jumped on the phrase value-free. If the public realm was supposed to be value-free, then where would values be cultivated? In the private realm. And who would be responsible for cultivating them? Women. And so for the first time ever, women were held to be morally superior to men. I have to stress this because we're so used to the double standard. Women had never been seen as morally or spiritually superior before. Never. This was totally new. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, it had been thought that men were morally superior. Their reasoning was the insight into right and wrong is a rational insight, and men were thought to be more rational, and therefore men were thought to be more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue comes from the Latin vir, means man. So, as in the word virile. So virtue had overtones of manly strength and honor. And so this was totally new in the 19th century when people began to say, well, I guess it's women who will have to be the moral guardians of society. And what happened is by the early 19th, so the flappers were like 1920s, early 20th century, right? What happened is women got tired of being the conscience of men. And many began to say, well, why can't we have fun too? Why can't we? The flappers were criticized for going to movies, reading trashy novels, romance novels, wanting to go to bars, wanting to wear short skirts, wanting to smoke and drink. All the things men were doing, except the short skirts, I guess. but movies and bars and drinking and smoking, these were all things that it was already accepted for men to do. And women like, well, why should we be the ones who are held responsible for being good, when men are allowed all these freedoms? And so that's what the flappers represented in their time, like the early 20th century, 1920s or so. Of course, the Christians at that time was kind of the fundamentalist era. So the Christians at the time who were fundamentalists were aghast. They were outraged at the flappers because they represented women sort of giving up their role as the moral guardians of society and saying, why should we bear that responsibility? We want to have fun like the men. And so, unfortunately, what happened is a lot of fundamentalists criticized the flappers for imitating men. if it's a bad thing, then it's a bad thing for men too. So I think that there were, on the one hand, fundamentalists also did have higher standards for men. So that was good. But it is kind of ironic that they were criticizing women for aping men. That was one of the words they used. Women are now, instead of holding men in check morally, women are imitating or aping men. So that was a criticism of the flappers.
Yeah, I don't know.
It was basically when women said we're no longer going to uphold the double standard. That's the way to rethink of it.
Yeah, it's like, oh, well, I was just thinking, wow, and look where that gets us, when you say, well, they aren't being responsible, I'm not going to be responsible either, or have any responsibility on me either. And then we end up in a culture right now where, there's no responsibility. And who's taking care of children? Who's, you look around at the dating landscape today in like 30s and 40s, and it's like a bunch of, I say, you look at the dating landscape and it's a lot of 30 and 40-year-olds who are trying to relive being like 13, 14, and no one wants any responsibility or any cares or any family tying you down or relationships tying you down. And so that's kind of unfortunate. I'm curious, going back to that father concept, I loved your book, Love Thy Body. And do you see any correlation of, this attack on masculinity, fathers abdicating their roles, and the confusion that has come sexually for kids growing up in these homes?
Yeah, well, certainly. The Love Thy Body is, its major theme is that so many of our moral issues today are rejection of the body. It starts with abortion, where professional bioethicists today all agree that life begins at conception. You will not find a major bioethicist who doesn't agree. The evidence from DNA and genetics is just too strong to deny it. So what do? They say, well, being human doesn't matter. Being human doesn't give you any special status. You have to become a person defined in some sort of mental categories and self-awareness, self-consciousness, and so on. And so abortion rests on the notion that being human no longer has any moral meaning. It no longer gives you any status. Human rights no longer depend on being human because they admit the human is fetus. The fetus is human. And yet they say it could be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be tinkered with genetically. It can be used for experiments and research. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, as Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste, which is exactly how medical journals talk about the fetus, by the way. It's medical waste. And so being human is no longer enough for human rights. And that becomes sort of the pattern for all of the rest of the moral issues. The most obvious being transgenderism, which says, your biology as male or female has nothing to do with your gender identity. BBC did a documentary in which they said, at the core of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. And in that war, it's the mind that wins. Well, BBC also did a documentary for teenagers, and they showed a young woman. She was clearly a woman, but she identified as non-binary. And she said, it doesn't matter what meat skeleton you've been born in. It's your feelings that count. So again, it's that denigration of the body. Now it's just a meat skeleton. I have to read the academic literature because that's what filters down eventually. So the first book by a philosopher, no, I don't think she was a philosopher, but she's a professor at Princeton. And she wrote a book defending transgenderism. And here's how she put it. She said, what the physical body tells us is nothing. It has no meaning at all. So that's behind, first graders are coming home from school now saying, my teacher said, just because you have boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy. Just because you have girl parts doesn't mean you're a girl. There was one that was in the news where a first grade girl came home saying that. And she said to her mom, please take me to a doctor so we can find out what I am. And so it was in the news because the parents were suing the school for mental distress. But the point is, all of this is a denigration of the body. And that's why the book is called Love Thy Body. I read an interview with a young girl who's a detransitioner. She had lived as a trans boy from age 11 to age 14, and then had reclaimed her identity as a girl. And this quote is just perfect. She said, "The turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body." And it came out too late to put in my book, but it would have been a perfect quote for a book titled Love Thy Body. So I think this sense of young people being very confused about their sexuality, in particular, their biological sex, comes from a kind of rejection of the body. And it's a total turnaround, right? Because most people think it's Christianity that says the physical world doesn't matter, your body doesn't matter, all that matters is your soul, your spirit. But actually, Christians have a much higher view of the body than today's secular atheist view that says your body's just a hunk of matter. They're philosophical materialists or naturalists, so that your body is just a piece of matter with no higher meaning. Like that Princeton University professor said, it has no meaning at all. So it's actually Christianity that says your body does have meaning. It has dignity. It's created by God, by a loving creator. And we are called to honor our body and respect our body and live in accord with the creator's design. So that's sort of the nutshell on how Love Thy Body fits in with these themes.
I just think it's curious because it really starts there with loving thy body and then branches off into this masculinity and this femininity. I'm really grateful that I read these books both even in order, because until you're able to even understand and accept how God created a man and how God created a woman and how they are different, it's hard to even have a conversation about masculinity. It really gets boiled down to, do you feel more predatory or do you not? In a secular conversation, and kind of identifying those toxic traits as, I put in air quotes, those toxin masculinity traits as, well, then you must be a man if you would like to act out in this way. And I don't know. It's cool how you are showing with research all these things that I think we've just come to accept as a culture over time. You go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, and I don't realize how much I have just accepted and have these cultural lenses on when I look at the world. And you peel back those layers and go, whoa, let's go back. Let's identify, where did these things come from and how can we remove those lenses that are on our eyes and replace them with a biblical lens. So how can people find your books?
Well, of course, Amazon, like everything is on Amazon. But my publisher very generously redesigned my website. So you can now, it's colorful and fun. And so nancypearcey.com. Pearcey has an extra E, so it's Pearcey, nancypearcey.com. So that you can come over, you can browse my other books, you can see who endorsed them, and you can leave a comment too, which I really enjoy. I read them. I don't have time to answer all of them, but come on to nancypearcey.com and come over and say hello.
Well, Professor Pearcey, thank you so much for all the time you've given us. You've been such a blessing to our home. I know you're going to be a huge blessing to our audience, and we really pray that you continue your great work. It's a huge encouragement to the body of Christ, and it's a very important work. So thank you so much, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. And I really appreciate your questions. Everyone has slightly different questions, and you had really interesting, penetrating questions. So I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Awesome. Bye-bye.